All right, all right. Well, thank you again, everybody. Keep reading what is brought other people here this morning. I'm sure there's a lot of overlap and a lot of connections. So as we move on, oh, I didn't even mean to leave this slide in here. Some of you may have had time. This was just optional work reading before the session about the principles of environmental justice and some analysis of EnviroScreen 4.0. If you read those or had time to look at those materials, you could let us know in the chat. You could also look at those later. I just wanted to remind you that our webinar series has been organized by through a partnership between the California Environmental Literacy Initiative and the California Subject Matter Projects. And there's a whole team of folks, many of whom are with us this morning, some who are not because of other commitments. And so I wanted to just go ahead and recognize the folks whose names you see on the screen. I think we have one committee member who's joining us that wasn't here first time. Harold, do you want to just take a minute to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thank you, Tom. Good morning, everybody. I'm so excited to be here and excited to meet you. I'm the director of the Bay Area Math Project, one of the 19 sites of the Math Project, and have collaborated in the design of this professional learning. Thank you, Tom. Back to you.
All right, thank you.
Because I remember last time.
So this is a relevant time for us to just put up some norms for our Zoom meeting. So one of the things we'd like to do, and I can do this myself, is change our names in the Zoom room just to provide a little info to the other participants when we're in the breakout rooms and conversations. So just putting your name, a last name initial is enough, your location, city or county, and the subject you teach or the organization that you represent. And we're going to have more time in today's session to participate in conversations together. And I know that the participants in this workshop, this series, are going to have amazing ideas. So I hope that you'll all be really open to hearing from each other, but also open to sharing your ideas about how you can bring this perspective and the topics of environmental justice to your students. So please keep your mic on mute when we're in the main room, just so that there isn't too much background noise. If you get muted by one of the co-hosts, please don't take offense. It's just to keep a quiet room. But we do want to hear from folks, so please do type your thoughts in the chat at any time. And when we're in the breakout rooms, there'll be time to talk. But if you have a question or a comment that you really want to interject when we're in the main room, just raise your hand and one of us will acknowledge you. We've got multiple co-hosts, so that will help us recognize.
I'm really fortunate to be the fifth.
Okay. So as we get into the material, I just want to include an Indigenous land acknowledgement that we in this group recognize that all Californians benefit from resources afforded by occupied land that was and still is the home and cultural heritage of hundreds of groups of Indigenous peoples. And we're excited partially about this series because it can offer an opportunity for all of us to be more intentional, thoughtful, and respectful in the way we form a relationship with the land and resources of California. So please do kind of reflect on that, get connected with the traditional inhabitants of the region where you live and teach, and hopefully you will find that this statement on the right side of the slide is true. Okay, so just a little recap, right? Because not everybody was here last time, but also it's been a while, right? We're only meeting once a month, so I know a lot happens between our meetings. So in session one, we started addressing these two goals of the series, which is to encourage interdisciplinary inquiry and culturally and community responsive instruction around environmental literacy and specifically environmental justice. And then the second goal was about increasing the use of geospatial tools and geographic perspectives by teachers and students to engage with the environment from where they are, from where they live and teach and learn. So our session one guiding question was, how can a place-based approach enhanced by geospatial tools help students to think more deeply about the ways human and natural systems interconnect? and interrelate. And towards that end, we learned about the environmental literacy ladder. We met geographer Yi-Fu Tuan and kind of thought about his representation of geography as the study of Earth as the home of people. And we took a look at the topic of air pollution through a map that allowed us to see real-time air quality data, active fires, wildfires in California, and information about air movement that helps us understand how smoke from fires could become an air quality risk for different communities around California. Okay, now we're in session 2, and our question is, how can place-based inquiry and access to relevant data promote environmental justice and learning in different subject areas? So the environmental justice keyword is going to be pulled out today, and really we're gonna reflect a lot on what that means. And then we will get in session 3 to thinking about the resources and supports that are available to bring geospatial tools into teaching and learning for environmental justice in your classrooms. So that we will get there in the next session. So, but as I mentioned, we need to get a little deeper into this idea of environmental justice and what does it mean to use an environmental justice lens. I'm going to turn over to the mic to Shelley Brooks from the California History Social Science Project to cover the next part of our material.
Great, thank you, Tom, and good morning, everyone. So as Tom mentioned, I come from the History Social Science project, and so I'm bringing that lens to the work that I do, thinking as a historian thinks. And I, when I see this question, you know, what does it mean to use an environmental justice lens? I think about how when studying history, we already use certain lenses to investigate the past, right? Some of the more common ones would be an economic lens or social, cultural, or political lens, and where the questions that we ask to drive our investigations will focus on a specific realm, right? And so, for instance, I think about when I teach post-World War II US history, I sometimes have asked, why did social movements in the United States take off in the years after World War II? But if we're using an environmental justice lens, we can look at a broad range of issues that are connected to the land and natural resources. That's the environmental aspect of this environmental justice lens. But to really dig into the justice component, we obviously also need to consider such things as the policies that govern land management and the equitable access to healthy life supporting environments, right? So the justice part really has to be strong. And I was thinking, you know, what would be an inquiry question that would help students think through an environmental justice lens? And something I would propose perhaps to students would be, how does climate change exacerbate existing inequalities, right? So, you know, how do we use this inquiry approach to help students, you know, have a certain lens when they're studying an issue? And Tom, if you don't mind advancing to the next slide, please. And so the question I just posed about climate change exacerbating existing inequalities, it helps us understand the evolution of the environmental justice movement itself. And the environmental justice movement embraces this principle that all people and communities are entitled to equal protection of environmental, energy, health, employment, education, housing, transportation, and civil rights laws. So, right, all these things being interconnected in the way people experience their place. And we can see how this movement combines a focus on environmental quality with a commitment to social justice. And given these intersections of people and power and the environment, it's not surprising to find the roots of our country's environmental justice concerns in the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. And okay, this is a historian in me. I just would love to share this quote that I came across when studying Earth Day at one point and realizing, oh my goodness, wait, in 1970, people were already talking about environmental justice without actually naming it as environmental justice. But you probably have heard of James Farmer, the co-founder of the civil rights organization, Congress of Racial Equality, more commonly known as CORE. And Farmer in 1970 was serving as the Federal Assistant Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare. And he stepped outside of his office on this first Earth Day and gave a speech. And you see behind him, it's recorded, and you see behind him, you know, this federal building. And he delivers this address that articulated the linkage between poverty, race, and environmental degradation. And he argued, quote, "The garbage, the trash, the carbon monoxide, the junk, who suffers most from it if it is not the poor? And so the poor, especially the ghettoized poor, the Black and the brown and the red, stand to benefit first from any successes in cleaning up the environment," end quote. As I mentioned, Farmer didn't use this term environmental justice, but obviously these issues continued to be of great concern to many community leaders. And the term environmental justice became widely known in the early 1980s. As a result of community protests in Warren County, North Carolina, in a particular part of the county where there was a large concentration of residents who are African American. And these residents were very frustrated by the fact that they were having to deal with illegal dumping of toxic waste in close proximity to their town. And residents used tactics from the civil rights movement, like nonviolent protests, to bring attention to the racist policies that enabled the dumping to happen in the first place and then to continue as it did. And so the environmental justice movement included not only those who carried forward the demands from the civil rights movement, but also the demands of the indigenous communities that highlighted the original environmental injustices in North America. We can think about, obviously, thinking about people arriving to North America, becoming settlers who drove Native peoples from their homelands and very intentionally sought to sever these traditional relationships of Native people with the earth. And this image that we're looking at right here is of delegates to the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit in Washington, D.C. in 1991. And this is the delegation that defined the principles of environmental justice that we all read, or that you have links to, that we were discussing in the chat a little bit. And I'll just point out how we can really see the indigenous worldviews represented in the very first of these principles. And I'll read that. Principle 1, environmental justice affirms the sacredness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction. Tom, if you don't mind advancing, please. As we know, it continues to be of great importance that society recognizes the impact of environmental injustices. We can see here some really stark statistics. And we felt it all. This was part of the news cycle pretty regularly in the early parts of COVID, when we were feeling the impact of environmental racism, as it was well documented that COVID was particularly deadly among populations with compromised respiratory function. And that compromised respiratory function often resulted from the dirty air that these populations were breathing because of living in close proximity to freeways and industrial sites. That if we go back into the history and look at the policy or redlining, other sort of decisions made at city or state levels about placement of polluting industries or freeways, often race was a component in understanding where things ended up that did cause this sort of pollution. On the next slide, we see that this is obviously a long-standing problem. There's an article here from 2009 that lays out the linkage between transportation corridors, like the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach, and along truck routes in Riverside, that directly contribute to children's asthma burden. So these children are bearing a high burden as a result of our global movements, a high health burden, I should say, as a result of our global movements of goods. And if we go to the next slide, please, we see this environmental justice definition. And so I think it bears asking, you know, what would it look like to achieve environmental justice, right? Because when we talk about environmental justice, we're often also talking about environmental injustice, right? But justice would suggest that we've gotten close to something good, an equitable experience. And so, but more than just an experience. And so I wanted to just spend a moment looking at the definition and how it's worded. This is from the Environmental Protection Agency. It provides two important points in my mind. It means making sure that laws and policies don't lay a heavy burden on certain populations, like those living in so-called sacrifice zones. We've heard of Cancer Alley, right, in Louisiana, or other industrial corridors that land management policies have allowed to exist, often near certain populations that have, and then the health impacts of that. So that's part of it, right? It's making sure that there isn't a heavy burden. But importantly, achieving environmental justice also means the inclusion of the very people who are impacted by environmental injustices in the policies that will impact their futures. And I'm guessing you've heard about this, but I just would point out one thing that I think, you know, since this definition was first created by the Environmental Protection Agency, which came about in part because of protests like what happened in Warren County, North Carolina, and the increased attention that the federal government was really forced to pay to these issues around environmental injustices because of community activism. So by the 1990s, the EPA was taking a stock of environmental injustices, starting to pay attention to those for the first time. But it's just quite recently under Biden that we have a federal environmental justice advisory council meant to advise the government on policies related to health and the environment. And the people who make up this advisory council are the people who've been doing the community level work of calling attention to and proposing solutions to environmental injustices. And so I think it brings this back to, you know, the importance of looking locally, thinking about our communities, thinking about the work that can be done locally and how that can build and move ahead. So Tom, perhaps that was a segue into what you are thinking for the next slide.
Let me remember to unmute. Thank you, Shelley, for kind of giving us a little bit of the lineage of this lens, right, where it came from. And like a lot of other kind of breakthroughs in critical thought, it's folks who are experiencing inequality or experiencing difficulties that kind of have to lead the way in helping us advance our thinking. So I wanted to just bring it back to the environmental literacy ladder that I introduced in the first session. And I found, and I saw some people saying they hadn't seen those principles of environmental justice or know that they were more than 30 years old. I had the same reaction. But one thing I was really struck by was the kind of radical ecological perspective in the 17 principles, the kind of idea of treating the environment with a high level of respect. And then when you see the EPA definition, I think it backs away from that radical ecological perspective and looks more at a social justice equity lens. So that's an interesting, just kind of thinking about why is that, and maybe which part of those 17 principles are easier to enact and which ones are more difficult. When I looked at the environmental literacy ladder, which I introduced because it really talks about the fact that people, students, are going to need knowledge and skills, but they're also going to need dispositions, right? They're going to need a motivation, an emotional basis maybe for caring about the relationship between the environment or human life, or there's something I think missing from this environmental literacy ladder when we turn it to focus on environmental justice. Anybody want to suggest in the chat or unmute and say how this environmental literacy ladder needs to be modified?
Tom, if I could offer a thought, I was just typing this. It seems like the attitudes of appreciation really ought to be that first rung, starting with why, like Simon Sinek would say. We're starting with what, what is the relationship? But the why to me seems all the more critical.
I agree.
As a starting point.
I agree with that, Jim. Thank you. And attitudes of appreciation and concern for the environment, I think also that attitudes of appreciation and concern could be broadened. And I think the environmental justice movement says concern for the environment and concern for all fellow people and the way in which they're experiencing their connection with the environment. So I agree that it probably starts from that attitude of concern and appreciation. But in this case, we're thinking about equity among people and not just the way people relate to the environment, which the original environmental literacy ladder was really laid out for. So hopefully that's helpful, and I just wanted to bring that back in. And we had been talking about last time our topic of air quality or air pollution burden, right? And I introduced the map, the one with the line through it here, air quality and fire locations, to look at how one source of air pollution occurs, that it's kind of spatial extent and distribution, and how it causes challenges for different communities based on air circulation and weather systems and things like that. And we talked about how that might not be the most complete way of addressing air quality as an environmental justice issue, because wildfire is just one source of pollution, and it's perhaps one of the less managed or manageable sources, right? Wildfire is a natural occurrence, even though there's human-caused wildfires. It is not a planned impact in terms of the way the smoke from wildfires impacts California communities. But a lot of other things that the folks who are concerned about environmental justice, where you dump toxics, where you route highways, where you place schools and hospitals and residential properties, those are things that we plan, and those are things that we should be able to look at and kind of rethink through a lens of environmental justice. So I know the maps are a little bit overwhelming to folks who aren't used to looking at maps. So I apologize for having 3 map links here and not just one like last time. But let's just dig into the first one, which, like the air quality and fire locations, I made using ArcGIS Online. And let me see if I click from here, if you guys see the map. Yep, okay. So what I did is I just went back to ArcGIS Online and kind of grabbed, again, more layers of data, more layers of information to help me dig into this issue of air quality as an environmental justice issue, or using that environmental justice lens. So I'm going to open this layer list here, and these are all of the layers that I've included in the map. It's more than last time, so apologies that it's going to be more overwhelming. I will address this later and offer some times to walk people through the maps that need more help with that. But one of the things that I wanted people to know is that it's not just one big mass of air over California. For purposes of management and government regulation, we have air basins. And those air basins are tracked and monitored and managed separately because there's different activities happening in different parts of the state. So we can start to think about, how does the government of the state of California address and manage air quality? We can start to think about the things that introduce pollutants in concentrated ways. So ports, places where there are shipping terminals, cause a lot of localized pollution. So I brought in a map that shows where the ports are, and you can click on a port here and see the level of activity in a particular port area. Well, there's a lot more trucks than than ships. So I pulled in a layer that shows truck traffic, and I think this one might take a while to draw. This is tough doing the live demo well on Zoom because it clogs up bandwidth. But in this layer, let's see if I can make it draw by giving it less area. What this shows you is the truck volume traffic when the layer generates throughout California highways. So you can see the concentration of truck volume. Some of you who are clicking through the links on your own may already see this. I don't want to wait too long. So I have two layers here, one about traffic volumes and one about truck volumes. And I am not sure why I tested this all last night to make sure these things wouldn't take too long to pull up, but of course I wasn't on Zoom. Let's just give it another minute to resolve. What this would allow you to do is see the exposure of very specific local areas to traffic emissions, from the tailpipe emissions from automobiles and the tailpipe emissions from trucks, which are different qualitatively. Okay, I am going to give up on that and not see if it will give it one more chance. This is the worst part of technology, is that it doesn't always do what you want at the moment you want it to do it. Well, I'll click on a less data intensive layer. So we might want to look at like where oil refineries and oil terminals are. So if I go to Los Angeles here, you can see there's a high concentration of facilities around Los Angeles, and each one of those is generating particular pollutants. We can look at electric power plants. I know that one's big and going to take a lot of time to generate. But the California Air Resources Board also gives us measured pollutants from every registered facility. So if you are a facility that produces emissions, air emissions, you have to register with the state, and they monitor the amount of emissions you're producing. So here, some of these big circles around Los Angeles would be affiliated with those refineries. So you could see actually how much is happening there. Apologies for the map, you're all experiencing the same problem what I am, which is Zoom's hogging your bandwidth and making the map load slow. There's also here data on where farmlands are, because there's particular types of pollutants that are generated by the disturbance of the soil that happens with plowing and harvesting, the application of pesticides. Those things are going to cause other localized problems. So you can see, you know, in the Imperial Valley, for example, all of the farmland and the communities around there are going to be introduced to air quality problems that are related to farm operations. Okay. We can also think about what some of the consequences are. So this is just county level data looking at asthma rates. So it turns out that the asthma rate varies greatly by location across the state of California. And one of the major impacts on that variability in the asthma rate will be the amount of exposure to air pollution. So we can look at where people are being affected by air quality issues in terms of their health conditions. And then we can also think about who are the people, right? If we're thinking about environmental justice, it's not just a matter of people experiencing negative environmental characteristics, but we're interested in the kind of differential exposure of different types of people by class, by race or ethnic category. So I've included some data in here about race and ethnicity. If you click on all three of these by county, census tract, and state, what'll happen is it'll resolve differently as you zoom in. So I get a figure here for Imperial County that it's predominantly Hispanic or Latino, and it gives me the breakdown of the population by the racial and ethnic categories in the census. But if I zoom in, I can actually get it to resolve down to the census tracts and see the variation in the population of different communities. So even though the county is predominantly Hispanic, that does not mean every community will be. If we switch over here to San Diego, you'll see we get areas, and I should show you that this will bring up the legend. So there's areas that are predominantly Asian, areas that are predominantly Hispanic and Latino, and areas that are predominantly non-Hispanic white. Any one of these census tracts actually includes people of all those different categories, or most of those different categories. So what we're seeing in the color is just the predominant group, but not the only group that's included. So this gives us a way to look at kind of the racial diversity, racial and ethnic diversity of the populations that are kind of underneath these different air quality conditions, right? So if we find out that there is a difference in the exposure of a person that can be predicted by their race or ethnicity, now we see an environmental justice issue. If your race or ethnicity impacts your likelihood of exposure to an environmental toxin or carcinogen or just a negative environmental characteristic, that becomes a starting point for thinking about an environmental justice issue. So I'm going to jump off of this map because some of the more interesting layers aren't appearing. And I'm going to just show you that I put a couple other maps on here. Now the links are going directly to the maps. All of these maps are linked on our Cella Interactive Environmental Atlas. So you can find all these maps by going to the Cella website. One of the readings was about the Cal EnviroScreen results. Right? So Cal EnviroScreen is this tool that uses ArcGIS online mapping and all of these data sources to try and assess the pollution burden of different communities in California, all of the different pollution burdens. So that makes it a little hard to zero in on a specific issue like air quality unless you go to the indicator maps. So what's the Office of Environmental Health and Safety, I think at OEHS, that produces Cal EnviroScreen, makes these individual layers available so you can see what's happening. So these are active maps, and they just show one layer at a time, so they probably load a little quicker. So for example, we can learn about specific types of air pollution, ozone, and look at the spatial distribution of ozone as an air pollutant in the state of California. What's really cool about this is it tells you why you should care on the left here. What is ozone and how does it translate into health problems or health disparities for Californians? We can learn about particulate matter, and particularly the small particulate matter that's most problematic in causing problems like asthma or lung disease. And so we can see there's a different distribution of PM 2.5. It looks quite different than what we saw with ozone, right? This has a lot to do with localized sources. We can look at another kind of air pollutant which is linked to different health problems, and we can look at diesel particulate matter. And again, Cal OEHS is giving us some description of why they care about this and why they monitor it and what the problems associated with it. And then you can see where it's happening, right? So you can see this diesel particulate matter is a big problem in our larger cities, the Bay Area and Los Angeles and San Diego, but you also wonder what's going on out here, right? This big blot out in the middle of the desert. My guess is that has to do with military operations and generation of some emissions from military vehicles or military equipment. So in this map, you can isolate individual factors in air quality, learn a little bit more about them, and see the geography, see the spatial extent and the severity of the problem in different locations. If you look under here, under population characteristics, you can also look at things like asthma or cardiovascular disease, which are associated with air quality, where air quality is a factor in producing those negative health outcomes. And we can also look at vulnerability factors for people, things like linguistic isolation, poverty, unemployment. So we can start to see how these things co-occur in space and how it's not just a coincidence that some of these pollutants are allowed to accumulate in areas where particular types of people are found, whether those are people of certain racial or ethnic groups or people of certain economic categories. Okay, so the third map in here is I won't even go into that, but this is the results map. So that's the map where you can look up your individual address or zip code and find out the whole list of pollution burdens in that particular location, right? So if we're taking our eye off of air quality and just want to understand, maybe to do a bit more of a scan for what types of environmental burdens does my community face, Cal EnviroScreen is going to give you that list of where you stand on all of those individual measures that we just looked at in those maps. Okay, are there any questions? Or I know this is a lot to throw at you. And what I will do is I'll announce some office hours between now and our third session. So if anybody wants more time to kind of ask questions, or if you're interested in working with ArcGIS Online more with your students, I can provide some support and help and some kind of starting points to help get you on the road to using these maps and the spatial data with your students. Okay. No, I see lots on the chat, but I don't see anything. Question. Right, linguistic isolation. I see people are interested, and there's all kinds of specific things that might apply to your community and not others. So that's what's great about this geospatial technology. It allows you to center your community, zoom in or zoom out, and then dig through the layers of information to find the ones that are most relevant to your community. Okay. I think that's enough of me talking. I did want to point out, if you go into Cella as a tool for environmental literacy and environmental justice learning, one of the things I try to do is make sure that people can find out who is on this subject, who's working on this topic. So in this area of air quality, people should know that the California Air Resources Board has a lot of information available that is relevant to teachers and students. So they have this program called People at Risk that offers a lot of information about the causes and consequences and potential solutions related to air pollution. And there's also educational resources. And I don't know why the second part of my parenthetical expression doesn't show up there. But there's resources there that you can access, including lesson plans and materials that you can use directly with your students. So it's important that we kind of know who's on this job and who we would want to advocate with if we wanted to see change in a local community. Okay, so now we want to make sure that you educators have time to think about and process and talk to each other about how you might use this information, right? So we're going to now put you into breakout groups. Sorry, these questions are not for the breakout groups. These are questions that you might reflect on as you're looking at the maps that I just shared later, right? About thinking about whether your community is impacted by air pollution. If so, what kinds of things would you want to investigate? And if it's not air pollution, maybe your community doesn't suffer air pollution. If you're a coastal community, chances are you've got good air quality. Well, what are the environmental conditions impacting people in your community? Because if it's not air quality, Cal EnviroScreen and geospatial technologies can help you figure that out. But in your groups, we want to narrow it down and think about your work as a teacher, right? So the two prompts here are, and maybe I was going to let Shelley take this. I'm realizing, sorry about that, Shelley, I'm talking over top of your section. So
I think you, oh no, okay, well, I think this is great. We hopefully, I'm not just saying hopefully, I'm guessing that probably you're already thinking about teaching strategies and learning experiences that will help you weave an environmental justice lens into your classroom, right? And perhaps even across the subjects in your school, how you might collaborate. And so just wanted to raise these prompts for the breakout room discussion. And just remember, of course, session 1, we were talking about student and community interests in environmental justice issues and where those topics and those issues, those events could come up or already do come up within your teaching. And we want to continue that conversation today, right, in these breakout rooms and pulling in what we've been learning about in terms of uneven pollution burdens for California communities. And of course, let's keep this environmental justice lens in mind, help us better understand or define what that means for us and for our teaching. And so there'll be disciplinary breakout rooms and also team based. We know some of you came together as a team, school team or other type of team. So I believe Amy's created breakout rooms for us that will enable you to choose which rooms to go into.
That was a good conversation. I know we ended up with a lot of people in one science room, so hopefully you shared this space well. We were meaning to get multiple science rooms up for you, but we want to continue this. I know that so far in this series there's been a lot of information put towards you, and there was some comments in the first session about wanting more time to process and think about the application. And we heard that, and we certainly support that goal, because our goal wasn't necessarily to put on 3 webinars for teachers, but it was to give teachers tools that they could then pivot and use in the classroom. So we certainly want to facilitate the conversations that are going to help you make that pivot. So what we're going to do now is kind of ask you to kind of level up the discussion. And so we're going to just randomly assign people into rooms and then ask you to identify one idea from your first conversation that you found particularly helpful in thinking about engaging students in learning for environmental justice. And then maybe, if you have a thought on this, specifically which entry points offer connections to multiple disciplines. So these are going to be bigger groups, and so what we thought we'd do is use this will be maybe a little more Zoom tutorial, the raise hand function. So whether that might be at the bottom of your screen or the panel that pops up at the top of your screen, depending on how Zoom works for you. And then it's the, excuse me, it's the option, it might be under the three dots. Interestingly, it doesn't let me raise hands because I'm a host, so I don't even see where it is. So if you need info about where the raise hand function is, just pop that in the chat, and somebody who knows better than I will, yeah, reactions on bottom row. Thank you, Sam. So once we're in these rooms, just take a minute to gather your thoughts. When you're ready to share something that you thought was useful, hit the raise hand function, and we'll have a facilitator in each room to just kind of recognize folks and move around the room and hopefully kind of glean out the most promising ideas from the conversation so far. Okay, manager of breakout rooms, are we ready?
We're going in there for 15 minutes?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you. 15 minutes out at 10:50, 10:52, let's say.
Tom, did you want to mention the plan to record these for those who can't make it today? Is that
Yeah.
still the plan?
Yes, exactly. So we've been recording these sessions and making them available. In this case, the facilitator is going to record the breakout room so that people who missed this will be able to kind of tap into the conversations. Okay. All right, everybody. I hope that was a good, productive discussion. I know that this is really, when you get information like this, what I see is teachers' minds start spinning very quickly, thinking of all of the connections between what they already know and what they're teaching and what their students are interested in and where they can go with this new information. And so I encourage you to keep that up and to share it with us. We are again going to ask you to provide feedback via a survey on this session. So the link is there on the slide, and Amy's probably already put it in the chat. Thank you, Amy. we really do want to hear from you, and I want to encourage you, if you feel like you need support or you have an idea that you want to develop, reach out to us. I put my email on the screen there, and I'd be happy to meet with you individually or to connect with some of our committee members to really help you advance your idea. So in the interest of that direction, the homework that, again, is optional, but that's proposed, is just for you to take the conversations from the first 2 sessions and start thinking about what's a lesson or learning activity that you'd like to develop for use in your classroom. And so if there's anything that you would need to be able to implement that lesson, kind of identify that, and that's something that we should be able to help you with as we move forward. So if you want to email, like I'm saying on the screen,